My husband threw me off a rocky cliff on our honeymoon, and I still remember the exact moment I realized he wasn't joking anymore. I remember Daniel Whitmore smiling like nothing in the world could possibly go wrong as the wind cut across the Big Sur coastline. I remember him saying, "Emily, come closer. I want you to see something beautiful." Just before everything in my life changed forever, I remember falling without understanding why. I remember the cold ocean air swallowing my scream. I remember the silence that followed like the world itself had turned away from me. And I remember thinking that love was supposed to protect you, not erase you, not destroy you, not end you like that. And yet that is exactly what my husband did to me on a cliff, overlooking the Pacific Ocean during what was supposed to be the happiest week of my life. It started long before that moment. It started the night before at a luxury lodge in Monterey, where Daniel corrected my voice in front of strangers and said, "She gets nervous easily, don't mind her," while the couple at the next table laughed politely as if I was a detail, not a person, and I remember sitting there smiling because I didn't want to ruin the night. I remember the waiter asking if everything was fine, and Daniel answering for me. "She's fine, she always overthinks things," and I remember how small I felt sitting across from my own husband like I was already disappearing. The next morning he drove us down Highway 1. The Pacific coast stretched out like a promise I didn't know I would never get to keep. And I remember asking him why we were stopping at that particular overlook, and he said, "You always wanted something unforgettable, didn't you?" And I laughed because I thought he meant romantic. I thought he meant thoughtful. I thought I knew the man I married. Before I continue, if this story speaks to your heart in any way, please take a second to like this video, subscribe, and share where you are watching from. Your city or country and even the time where you are right now means more than you think. It connects all of us across distance through stories like this, and only if this story truly resonates with you, stay with me until the end, because what I discovered after everything will change how you see trust forever. My name is Emily Carter. I am 29 years old, and this is the night my life stopped being mine and started becoming something I still struggle to explain. And now let me take you back to the beginning of how everything quietly cracked long before I ever saw that cliff. Daniel parked the car near a viewpoint where the road narrowed and the ocean dropped sharply into jagged rocks below. The air smelled like salt and stone and something uneasy I couldn't name, and I remember him standing too still beside me, watching the horizon instead of me, and I said softly, "This is beautiful." And he replied without looking at me, "Yes, it is," like he was talking about something else entirely, and then he turned and said, "Step closer, Emily. Don't be afraid." And something in his voice didn't match the man I knew. It was calm in a way that didn't feel safe. It felt decided, final, and I remember laughing nervously and saying, "You're acting weird today." And that's when he finally looked at me, really looked at me, and said, "You don't understand how things work, do you?" And before I could ask what he meant, his hand was on my shoulder and everything shifted in one unbearable second, and I was no longer standing. I was falling, not fast enough to be a dream, not slow enough to stop it, just suspended between disbelief and impact as the world turned sideways and the cliff disappeared above me. I don't remember hitting anything clearly, only the sensation of cold water and stone and silence wrapping around me like something ancient deciding whether I deserved to stay alive. And somewhere far above I thought I heard my name, but I couldn't tell if it was real or my mind refusing to accept the end. And then there was nothing, just nothing, until later, much later, when I would wake up and realize I was still breathing, when I shouldn't have been. What Daniel didn't know in that moment, what no one around us knew, was that survival has a strange way of rewriting everything you believed about endings. Because I did not die that day, I did not disappear the way he intended. And the truth is that someone saw something they were not supposed to see from that cliff road, someone who would later change the direction of everything. But at that moment I was just Emily Carter, 29 years old, lying between life and something else entirely, while above me my husband stood at the edge of the world, thinking he had already finished what he started. And the last thing I remember before darkness took me completely was the sound of his voice carried by the wind saying something I was never meant to hear. There are moments after survival that do not feel like relief. They feel like confusion that has not yet found its shape, and that was what I remember most when I opened my eyes in the hospital in Monterey County. Not pain, not fear, but the strange weight of being somewhere I did not recognize as life anymore. The ceiling lights too white, the air too clean, and the steady sound of machines reminding me that I was still here when I should not have been. A nurse was speaking softly beside me, her voice calm like she had done this 1,000 times. "You are safe now, Emily. You were brought in by fishermen off the coast." And I remember trying to respond, but my throat felt like it belonged to someone else, dry, distant, disconnected. And when I finally whispered, "My husband," there was a pause before she answered, "He is being notified." And something in the way she said it made my chest tighten in a way I could not explain, not because I expected comfort, but because I suddenly realized I did not know what story had been told about me yet. Later I would learn that Daniel had already spoken to the sheriff, already given his version, already shaped the first draft of my disappearance before I had even fully stopped drifting in and out of consciousness. And that realization did not arrive like shock. It arrived like memory returning slowly, dragging everything behind it. I remember the sheriff coming into the room for the first time, Jason Miller, a man in his 50s with tired eyes and a notebook that looked too ordinary for something so important. He sat down carefully and said, "Emily, I need you to tell me what happened." And I remember looking at him for a long time before answering, because part of me was not sure if telling the truth mattered when someone else had already written a different one, and I finally said, "We stopped at a cliff overlook on the Pacific Coast Highway," my voice barely holding itself together, and he nodded slowly, writing nothing yet, just listening. And then I added, "And then I was no longer standing there." And he did not interrupt, he just waited. And that silence was the first time I understood that doubt could exist even in official rooms. Hours later, when I was moved to a recovery ward, I overheard 2 staff members speaking outside my door, one of them saying, "The husband said it was a hiking accident, she slipped while taking photos," and the other replying, "That is what he told the deputy." And I remember lying still, staring at the edge of the blanket, realizing how quickly a life can be translated into something smaller, something easier to file away, and I whispered to myself, "That is not what happened." But even I did not know yet how much of the truth had already been buried under words I had not chosen. Days passed in a slow blur of medication schedules and questions that came and went, and Daniel never came to the hospital, not once in a way I could confirm. Only messages passed through administrators, arrangements handled like paperwork instead of panic, and one afternoon a nurse placed a folder beside my bed and said gently, "Your husband authorized these." Inside were forms I did not remember agreeing to, signatures I did not remember giving permission for, and a note from Daniel that read, "Rest, I will handle everything." And I remember laughing once, not because it was funny, but because something about being handled felt like being erased carefully. It was Dr. Hannah Reed who first said something that stayed with me, a young physician with steady hands and careful eyes. She reviewed my scans and said quietly, "You should not be here." And when I asked her what she meant, she replied, "Statistically speaking, your injuries from that fall should not have allowed survival at that distance." And I remember asking her, almost absent-mindedly, "So what does that mean?" And she paused before answering, "It means either you were incredibly lucky or something about the situation is not fully documented." And I did not know why, but I kept thinking about that word, documented. Meanwhile, fragments of memory kept returning in pieces, not the fall, but everything before it, conversations that once felt normal but now felt misplaced, Daniel telling me during breakfast in Carmel Valley, "You worry too much, Emily. That is your problem," and me replying, "I am not worried, I am just asking questions," and him smiling without warmth, "Same thing." And I remember how often I had learned to stop asking after that, how silence slowly becomes a habit before it becomes a choice. Another memory surfaced while I was still in recovery. Sitting alone by a window that looked out toward gray water, I thought of the night before the trip, a dinner in Monterey where Daniel's phone kept lighting up face down on the table, and when I asked who it was, he said, "Work too quickly." And I nodded, because I always nodded, because I had spent years believing that trust meant not needing to know everything. But the truth was, even before the cliff, there had been smaller disappearances, moments where I felt like I was being edited out of my own life, like when Daniel once said in front of friends, "Emily is amazing at supporting decisions." And I remember smiling because it sounded like a compliment until I realized it meant I was not the one making them. Or when he told a real estate client, "She prefers to stay behind the scenes," and I remember thinking I had never said that preference out loud. The most painful part was not the cliff. Not yet. It was how familiar everything felt leading up to it, as if I had been trained for years to accept versions of myself created by other people. One evening in the hospital, Sheriff Miller returned and sat down again. This time his expression more careful, he said. "We checked the initial call log from Daniel. He reported you slipped during a walk. No mention of anything else." And I asked him, "Do you believe him?" And he looked at me for a long moment before saying, "I believe there are gaps." And that word, gaps, stayed in the room long after he left. Later that night I lay awake, listening to the soft rhythm of machines and thought about how gaps are, where truth hides when no one is looking closely enough. And I realized then that my survival was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something I did not yet understand, because if Daniel's story was already accepted, and my voice was still fragile and incomplete, then what exactly had really happened on that cliff? And more importantly, why did it feel like the answer was already waiting somewhere I had not yet been allowed to see, just beyond the edges of what I could remember, just beyond what anyone had told me was possible? The third morning in the hospital felt different in a way I did not immediately understand, not because anything in the room had changed, but because I could feel something shifting beyond it, like the quiet before a storm that has already decided where it is going to land. And I remember staring at the ceiling tiles while a nurse adjusted the IV line and saying softly, almost to myself, "Something is not right." And she asked me what I meant. But I could not answer, because I did not yet have the words for what I was beginning to feel, only the sense that I was no longer simply recovering. I was being observed, managed, handled like an object in someone else's process. It started when Sheriff Jason Miller returned that afternoon, not alone this time, but with a man in a gray suit who introduced himself as a county legal liaison, and he did not sit at first. He just stood near the door like he was evaluating the room before deciding how much truth it could safely hold. And Jason said, "We need to clarify a few procedural matters regarding your status." And I remember blinking slowly, asking, "My status?" And the man in the suit finally sat down and opened a folder that did not belong in a hospital room. And what he said next changed the air between us. He said, "Your husband has initiated insurance proceedings based on an assumed fatality report." And for a moment I thought I had misheard him, because assumed fatality sounded like something that should only exist in paperwork, not in a life that was still breathing. I asked, "Assumed by who?" And he replied carefully, "By the initial report submitted at the time of incident." And then Jason added quietly, "Your husband filed within 12 hours, and there was something in the way he said it that made the room feel smaller. I remember laughing once, not because anything was funny, but because my mind refused to process how quickly a life could be converted into a claim, and I said, "So I am already a document," and no one answered that. Later that day, Daniel finally appeared, not in person, but through a video call arranged by hospital administration, and when his face filled the small screen beside my bed, I expected relief or confusion or even shock, but instead I saw something far more controlled. He looked calm, almost practiced, like he had already rehearsed what version of me he was willing to acknowledge, and he said, "Emily, I am glad you are receiving care," as if speaking to a situation rather than a person. And I remember staring at him for a long time before saying, "You told them I slipped," and he did not react immediately, only nodded slightly and replied, "That is what happened." And I said, "That is not what happened," and there was a pause. Not emotional, just procedural, like a line being reviewed before approval. Then he leaned back slightly and said, "You are under a lot of stress. You need rest. I am managing everything for us." And I asked, "For us, or for you?" And for the first time his expression tightened, just slightly, like a seam pulling under pressure, and he said, "Do not make this harder than it needs to be." And I realized then that I was no longer speaking to my husband in any meaningful sense. I was speaking to someone protecting an outcome. After the call ended, Jason stayed behind and said something that should have sounded reassuring but did not. He said, "He has legal authority as your spouse, which allows him access to certain decisions." And I asked, "Like what decisions?" And he hesitated before answering, "Financial accounts, insurance coordination, property management." And I remember repeating the last word slowly, "property," because suddenly I understood that what I thought was my recovery was actually being turned into redistribution. Over the next 24 hours, I began noticing the small intrusions. a bank notification I was not supposed to receive, an email confirmation about a policy adjustment I did not remember approving, and each one felt like a door quietly closing somewhere I could not reach. When I confronted Jason about it, he looked uncomfortable in a way I had not seen before and said, "There is something else you should know," and he placed a printed report on the table beside me, an amended insurance document dated just 2 weeks before the honeymoon, and I remember my eyes scanning the beneficiary section slowly, expecting my name, expecting anything familiar, but instead seeing something that did not make sense at first because the designation had been altered, and when I asked when that change was made, Jason replied, "It was processed and notarized through a private legal office in Los Angeles," and I said, "I never signed this," and he answered carefully, "The signature verification matches multiple prior documents," and in that moment, the room felt like it tilted slightly, not physically but internally, as if the ground beneath my understanding had shifted. I asked for a copy of everything, and when I read through the pages later that night, I noticed something that made my hands go still, a reference to a previous marital agreement clause, one I had never been made aware of in clear terms, a clause that tied certain financial outcomes to accidental death scenarios during travel, and I remember whispering, this was planned, not as an accusation, but as a realization forming slowly under pressure. The nurse came in later to check my vitals and asked if I was okay, and I said yes automatically, because I had learned long ago that saying otherwise did not change what was happening. That night I could not sleep, not because of pain, but because of something quieter, the feeling that I had been inside a story for years, without realizing someone else had already written its ending, and somewhere between the sound of the machines and the faint light outside the window, I remember Daniel once telling me during a drive through Carmel, "You trust too easily, Emily," and I had laughed then, thinking it was a personality comment, not a warning, and now it felt like the first sentence of something I had misunderstood for too long. Before dawn, Jason returned alone and said, "We are going to need to verify something from your past employment records," and when I asked why, he said, "Because your husband's legal team referenced prior clearance documentation," and I remember sitting up slowly and asking, "What clearance?" and he looked at me for a long moment before answering, "That is what we are trying to understand." And in that instant I felt it, not fear exactly but recognition, like a door I had kept closed for years had just been touched from the other side, and I realized that Daniel had not only tried to control what happened to me on that cliff, he had also reached into parts of my life that I had never expected him to find. And whatever he had discovered there was powerful enough to rewrite everything that came after, including why I was still alive when I was never supposed to be. The morning light in San Francisco did not feel like morning at all. It felt like something artificial, like the city had forgotten how to behave normally while I lay in that hospital bed listening to conversations that were no longer about my survival, but about what I legally represented in other people's documents. And I remember staring at the window thinking, I am still here, but nobody is speaking as if that matters anymore. And that was when everything shifted again, not through pain, not through fear, but through the sound of footsteps that did not belong to any nurse I recognized. The door opened slowly, and a man stepped inside wearing a dark navy coat with a government-issued badge clipped to his belt. And even before he spoke, I felt something in the room tighten, not because of authority alone, but because of recognition, and he paused when he saw me, just for a second too long, and said quietly, "Emily Carter," and I remember blinking because the way he said my name did not sound like introduction, it sounded like confirmation of something already known. Sheriff Jason Miller stood up immediately and said, "Captain Reynolds, I was not expecting you to come in person," and the man nodded once, still looking at me, and said, "I needed to see her myself." And then he walked closer, placed a folder on the table and said, "We are going to need to pause all assumptions surrounding this case," and I asked, "Who are you?" And he finally sat down and said, "I used to command operations coordination for naval intelligence support in the Pacific sector," and there was a silence after that sentence that felt heavier than anything I had experienced since waking up. Jason looked confused and said, "This is a local incident." But Captain Reynolds shook his head slightly and replied, "It was never local. Once her name appeared in a clearance archive, and I felt my breath slow without meaning to, because something about the word clearance did not belong in a conversation about cliffs and accidents and husbands. I asked him carefully, "What clearance?" And he looked at me as if he already knew I was going to ask that question and said, "We are still verifying, but your name appears in a compartmentalized personnel reference file tied to a long-term maritime surveillance advisory program." And I remember laughing once under my breath because it sounded impossible. And I said, "I work in marketing consulting. I design campaigns for retail clients." And he nodded slowly, but then added, "That is what your public record says." And that single sentence made the room feel colder. Jason stepped in and said, "Captain, she is a civilian victim in an ongoing investigation." But Reynolds did not take his eyes off me and replied, "That may be true now, but it does not explain why her husband had access to restricted insurance structuring channels normally reserved for federal contractors." And I remember my hands tightening slightly around the edge of the blanket, because suddenly the story I thought I was living had developed shadows I had never seen before. I asked him, "What does my husband have to do with any of that?" And he leaned back slightly and said, "That is exactly what we are trying to understand." And then he opened the folder and slid a single photograph across the table. It was a coastal map of Big Sur with markings along Highway 1, and I recognized the exact overlook instantly, not because it was beautiful, but because I had stood there for the last time I could remember clearly. And Reynolds said quietly, "This location has been flagged in multiple unrelated insurance incidents over the last decade." And Jason frowned and said, "Are you suggesting what I think you are suggesting?" And Reynolds answered, "I am suggesting we are not looking at a single event." And the words landed slowly, like something that had been waiting too long to be spoken. I looked at the map again and felt something in my memory resist, not break, but resist. Because suddenly even my recollection of that day felt like it was being pulled apart into smaller, less certain pieces. Then Captain Reynolds said something that made me stop breathing for a moment. He said, "Your husband's name is not new to us." And I asked, "What do you mean?" And he replied, "It appears in a prior cross-state insurance anomaly investigation linked to a presumed deceased spouse in Oregon." And the room went silent in a way that felt final, not temporary. Jason turned toward him and said, "If that is verified, this becomes federal." And Reynolds nodded once, then looked back at me and said, "Which is why I needed to confirm you were alive with my own eyes." And I remember asking, almost whispering, "Why?" And he paused before answering, "Because if you are alive, then everything we thought happened on that cliff is no longer just an accident report, it becomes intent." And in that moment I felt something inside me shift, not toward fear, but toward a slow, sinking awareness that I had been inside a structure much larger than a marriage or a moment of betrayal. After he left the room, Jason stayed behind longer than usual, and he said quietly, "I'm going to be honest with you, Emily. This is getting bigger than I expected." And I asked him, "Bigger how?" And he replied, "Bigger than county jurisdiction," and then he hesitated before adding, "And possibly bigger than your husband acting alone." And I remember sitting there staring at the closed door, realizing for the first time that Daniel had not just pushed me off a cliff, he had placed me inside a system I was only now beginning to see. And just before the end of that day, as the sun shifted across the hospital floor, I received a sealed envelope with no return address, and inside it was a single printed line that read, "If you survived, then you were never the intended final outcome." And I remember whispering into the empty room, "Then what was I supposed to be?" And the silence that followed did not answer me. It only confirmed that someone, somewhere, had already decided the answer long before I ever woke up. The envelope with no return address stayed on the hospital table longer than anything else in the room, not because it was large or dramatic, but because it felt deliberate, like someone had placed it there knowing exactly when I would notice it, and exactly how I would open it. And I remember sitting beside it for a long time, listening to the soft rhythm of machines and the distant footsteps in the hallway, before finally turning it over in my hands, feeling how ordinary paper can sometimes carry something heavier than metal. Inside was a single page, no signature, no explanation, only a line of text printed in a clean, clinical font that read, "Subject continuity confirmed across multiple identity layers." And I remember reading it once, then again slower, as if slowing my eyes could make it mean something different. And that was the moment I understood that whatever was happening to me was not beginning on that cliff. It had only been interrupted there. When Sheriff Jason Miller returned that evening, I showed him the paper without speaking, and I watched his expression change in a way I had not seen before. Not confusion, Not surprise, but recognition mixed with discomfort, and he said quietly, "Where did you get this?" And I replied, "It was in my room." And he took it carefully, like it might not belong in the same reality as the hospital walls around us, and he said, "This language is not local law enforcement terminology." And I asked him, "Then whose is it?" And he hesitated before answering, "It looks federal, but not standard federal." And that distinction made my stomach tighten because it suggested there were systems even he did not fully understand. The next morning Captain Reynolds returned, but this time he was not alone. There was another man with him, older, quieter, dressed in a plain suit without insignia, and he did not introduce himself immediately. He simply looked at me for a long moment and said, "So you are still alive," not as a question, but as a verification. And I remember replying, "Apparently I am," and that seemed to satisfy him in a way that unsettled me more than anything else. Jason stood near the window and said, "We are running out of jurisdictional clarity here," and the older man finally spoke, his voice calm and measured. "Jurisdiction is not the issue," and then he placed a thin file on the table and said, "Identity continuity is." And I asked, "What does that mean?" And he looked at me as if deciding how much truth I was allowed to receive at once, then said, "It means your life has been recorded under more than one operational profile." And I felt a cold stillness spread through me, because the phrase operational profile did not belong anywhere near my memories of marriage or vacation or ordinary life. I said, "I do not understand," and he nodded slightly as if that was expected, then added, "You are not the first individual associated with this name structure." And Jason immediately interrupted, "Are you saying there are duplicates?" And the man corrected him without hesitation, "I am saying there are parallel records," and that sentence made the room feel suddenly smaller. I remember looking at Captain Reynolds and asking, "You said my clearance name appeared in a file," and he answered carefully, "Yes," and I said, "Then tell me what I am," and there was a pause before he replied, "That is what we are trying to reconstruct." And in that moment I realized that even the people who had come to find answers were not certain what they were looking at. Later that day, Laura Bennett arrived from Seattle, not as part of any official system, but because Jason had called her after finding her contact in my emergency recovery file, and when she saw me, she stopped at the doorway and said, "Emily," in a voice that carried something I had not heard in days, familiarity without calculation, and I felt something in my chest loosen slightly, just enough to notice how tightly it had been held. She sat beside me and whispered, "They told me you were gone," and I replied, "So did almost everyone else." And she shook her head slowly and said, "That does not sound like you." And for the first time since waking up, I felt like someone was speaking to me instead of a case file. But the moment did not last long, because Captain Reynolds placed another document on the bed tray, this one older, slightly worn, and he said, "We recovered this from a secondary insurance audit trail, and when I looked down, I saw my name again, but not in the way I remembered it. It was attached to a reference code and a classification marker that I had never seen in my life, and below it, a list of coordinates including Monterey County coastline points, all marked with dates spanning years. I had no memory of being connected to in any formal way. I asked, "Why are there dates I do not recognize?" And Laura leaned forward and said, "Emily, those are not vacation records." And Jason finished her sentence quietly. "Those are operational timestamps." And I remember laughing once again, but this time it was empty, because the idea that my ordinary life could contain hidden timestamps felt impossible and yet already documented. The older man in the suit finally spoke again and said, "You are experiencing fragmentation because your public identity and your recorded identity are not aligned." And I said, "I do not have a recorded identity." And he looked at me and replied, "That is no longer a safe assumption." And in that silence I began to understand something I did not want to understand, that the Daniel I knew might not have been acting alone, and the life I thought I had been living might have been carefully placed inside something much larger, something that only revealed itself when it broke. And just before he left the room, Captain Reynolds said one final thing, almost quietly, "If you want the truth about the cliff, you will need to stop thinking of it as an accident and start thinking of it as a trigger." And after he left, Laura took my hand and said, "Emily, whatever this is, it did not start with you falling. and I looked out the window at the gray San Francisco sky and realized with a slow sinking certainty that I was no longer trying to understand what happened to me. I was trying to understand what I had been part of long before I ever knew there was a story to survive. The morning after Captain Reynolds left, the hospital felt different again, but this time it was not quieter. It was heavier, like the air itself had started carrying consequences instead of oxygen. And I remember sitting by the window in San Francisco General Hospital watching fog roll over the city like it was trying to erase something it did not want to be seen, when Sheriff Jason Miller walked in without knocking, followed by Laura Bennett and a man I did not recognize carrying a thick legal binder. And Jason said immediately, "We have something you need to see before it disappears." And the way he said disappears made my stomach tighten because it sounded less like a warning and more like experience. He placed a printed timeline on the table, layered with highlighted entries, dates, and financial movements, and Laura leaned closer and said, "Emily, this is not just your accident file anymore." And I looked at the page and felt my name scatter across years I could not remember living in the way they were described, and I asked quietly, "What is this supposed to be?" And the lawyer answered, "A cross-state insurance and identity continuity audit," and I repeated slowly, "Identity continuity." And Jason nodded, saying, "We traced financial instruments tied to your name across multiple jurisdictions." And for a moment I just stared at him because financial instruments sounded like something far away from the person who had once stood on a cliff in California, believing she was simply on a honeymoon. Then the door opened again, and Daniel Whitmore walked in. Not restrained, not arrested, just walking in like someone who still believed he belonged in every room he entered, and when he saw me, he stopped for half a second too long, and I noticed something I had never noticed before. Not fear, not guilt, but calculation, and he said softly, "Emily, you should not be here." And I remember replying, "I am here," and that was all I said. Jason stepped forward and said, "Mr. Whitmore, you are here under voluntary questioning conditions." And Daniel immediately responded, "This is harassment. My wife is recovering from an accident." And the word accident landed differently now, like something rehearsed too many times. And Laura said sharply, "Then explain the insurance submission timeline." And for the first time, Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked at the papers on the table, then at Jason, then back at me, and said, "You are all making this more complicated than it needs to be." And I felt something shift inside me because that sentence was not panic. It was control slipping. Jason placed another document in front of him and said, "We have records showing a policy adjustment 2 weeks before the honeymoon." And Daniel's expression tightened slightly as he said, "That is standard financial planning." And Laura replied immediately, "Not when it coincides with a remote coastal travel itinerary and an isolated incident location." And I watched him carefully because for the first time he was no longer speaking like someone explaining, he was speaking like someone defending. Then he turned toward me and said, "Emily, tell them what you told me before the trip. You agreed to the coverage structure." And I looked at him for a long moment and replied, "I do not remember agreeing to anything that involved my death." And the room went still. He exhaled sharply and said, "You are confused because of the trauma." And Jason interrupted, "We have independent verification of notarization signatures." And Daniel immediately raised his voice for the first time. "Those documents are being misinterpreted." And I remember how strange it felt, watching him lose balance without moving physically, like watching a structure crack internally. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse him. I simply said, "You told the sheriff I slipped." And he answered quickly, "Because that is what happened." And I said again, slower, "That is not what happened." And there was silence that no one rushed to fill. Then Laura placed her phone on the table and said, "We retrieved footage metadata from the Monterey Overlook camera system," and Daniel turned sharply and said, "That system is private property surveillance. You do not have access." And Jason responded calmly, "We do when there is probable interstate fraud activity." And that was when Daniel's composure finally fractured slightly, not into emotion but into blame, and he said, "This is being misrepresented by people who do not understand the full context of my marriage." And I looked at him and said quietly, "Then explain it." And he hesitated, just long enough to matter. The lawyer beside Jason opened another file and said, "We also found a prior incident marker associated with your financial advisory group in Los Angeles." And Daniel immediately said, "That is unrelated." But his voice was sharper now, and Jason asked, "Unrelated to what?" And Daniel did not answer. Instead, he turned back to me and said, "Emily, you are being influenced by people who are building narratives around you," and I felt something very clear in that moment. Not anger, not fear, but clarity, and I said, "No one is building anything around me, Daniel. I am listening to what is already written in your records." And for the first time he looked uncertain, just for a second, and that second changed everything. Laura stepped forward and said, "We are placing a temporary restriction on all asset movement, pending federal review." And Daniel immediately said, "You cannot do that without court authorization." And Jason replied, "We already have it." And the silence that followed was different from all the others, because this time Daniel did not have an immediate response. He looked at me then, really looked, and said, almost softly, "You do not understand what you are doing." And I replied, "I understand exactly what I am doing. I am telling the truth." And there was nothing loud about it, nothing dramatic, just a simple sentence that seemed to fill the entire room. Daniel's hands tightened slightly at his sides, and he said, "You think this ends with me?" And I answered, "I think this already ended before you pushed me off that cliff." And the room went completely still again, and Jason exhaled slowly as if confirming something he had been expecting. And Daniel finally looked away, just once, and in that small movement I understood that the story he had controlled for so long was no longer stable enough to hold him in it, because the truth had already started moving faster than his ability to explain it away. The silence in the room did not last long after Daniel left, because silence in places like that never really survives, it only changes shape. And I remember sitting by the hospital window watching fog roll in again over San Francisco like the city was trying to cover its own thoughts, when Sheriff Jason Miller returned with a new urgency in his step, followed by Laura Bennett and a woman in a dark blazer holding a tablet that looked like it had already been used too many times that day. And Jason said without sitting down, "We have confirmation of cross-case linkage." And the way he said it made it sound less like discovery and more like escalation. I looked at him and asked, "Linkage to what?" And he placed a printed map on the table, layered with pins and route lines stretching from Monterey County to Los Angeles and even a small cluster in Oregon, and he said, "To multiple reported spouse fatalities and insurance accelerations over the last 9 years." And for a moment no one spoke, because the pattern was too large to feel real in a single hospital room. Laura leaned closer and said, "Emily, your name is not isolated in this." And I replied quietly, "I never thought it was." But what I meant was something else entirely. I meant I had already begun to feel like I was part of something I had never agreed to enter. Then Jason opened another file and said, "We located financial correspondence between Daniel Whitmore and 3 separate legal entities." And the woman with the tablet added, "And those entities are currently under review for coordinated asset consolidation following unexpected spouse mortality events." And I remember repeating softly, "Unexpected spouse mortality events," because the words sounded like something written after the fact, not something that happened to a person. And then something unexpected happened. Jason's phone rang, he stepped out into the hallway, and when he returned his expression had changed in a way that made Laura immediately stand up and ask, "What happened?" And Jason said, "They are turning on each other." And for a second I did not understand what he meant. But then the woman in the blazer said, "Daniel's legal representation just withdrew part of their prior statement." And Laura asked sharply, "Which part?" And she answered, "The part confirming accident classification without reservation." And that was when the structure began to crack in real time. Within an hour, we were no longer just receiving documents. We were watching them contradict each other, because Daniel's attorney submitted a revised affidavit claiming miscommunication regarding incident sequence, while simultaneously the insurance coordinator attached to his filing requested a delay in payout pending clarification of survivability. And Jason looked at the paper and said, "They are distancing themselves." And Laura replied, "They are abandoning alignment." And I remember sitting there realizing I did not need to speak at all for the system around Daniel to start shifting away from him. Later that afternoon, Captain Reynolds returned again, but this time he did not bring files. He brought confirmation from another agency channel, and he said, "We are now seeing internal divergence in the supporting documentation chain." And I asked him, "What does that mean for Daniel?" And he answered, "It means he is no longer the only version of the story." And that sentence stayed in the room longer than anyone who said it, because by evening, things escalated further. Laura received a call and stepped outside, and when she came back, she looked pale and said, "His financial advisor just resigned and filed a compliance alert." And Jason immediately asked, "On what grounds?" And she replied, "Concerns regarding undisclosed risk exposure tied to client mortality sensitivity." And I remember whispering, "So they are all starting to speak at once." And Jason nodded once and said, "Yes, and none of them are saying the same thing anymore." The most unexpected moment came when Daniel himself reappeared in the system, not physically this time, but through a recorded legal deposition request that was suddenly unsealed due to procedural conflict between jurisdictions. And in the transcript, his own attorney questioned him about timing of policy adjustments, and I watched the screen as Daniel's recorded responses became less controlled, more defensive, and at one point he said, "I was advised to structure it that way." And the attorney asked, "By whom?" And there was a pause in the recording long enough to feel like something breaking, before Daniel answered, "By the same office that handled the prior case," and Jason immediately paused the playback and said, "That is new," and Laura added, "That connects him outward, not inward." And I asked quietly, "Outward to where?" And no one answered immediately. Instead, they began comparing documents side by side, and what emerged was not a single accusation but a network of shifting responsibility, where every person previously aligned with Daniel's narrative began rewriting their position in real time, one by one, until the consistency he had relied on simply stopped existing. And I remember Jason finally saying, "We are watching containment failure." And I asked him, "Containment of what?" And he looked at me and said, "Of the version of events he built around you." And that was when I understood something deeply unsettling, because I had assumed I was the center of what happened to me, but now I was watching as if I was only the point where everything else had started to break apart. By nightfall, Laura received one final message from an unknown federal review channel stating that Daniel Whitmore was now subject to multi-jurisdictional financial misconduct review with conflicting internal witness declarations, and Jason read it once, then said, "They are not coordinating anymore," and I asked, "So what happens now?" And he answered, "Now they try to protect themselves," and as I looked out the window again at the city lights of San Francisco, I realized I had not needed to fight anyone directly, because the truth had already begun doing something far more dangerous than confrontation. It had begun separating people from the version of reality they had agreed to maintain, and somewhere in that separation, Daniel Whitmore was no longer standing in control of the story he once believed he owned. The night after everything began to collapse around Daniel Whitmore, the hospital felt quieter in a way that was almost unfamiliar, not because the world had changed outside, but because something inside the system around me had stopped tightening and started loosening, like pressure finally finding cracks to escape through. And I remember sitting by the window watching San Francisco lights flicker through fog that moved like slow breathing, while Sheriff Jason Miller stood quietly near the door without speaking for a long time, not as an investigator anymore, but as someone who had stopped chasing answers and started accepting what they were becoming. Laura Bennett sat beside me holding a paper cup of coffee she never drank, and she said softly, "Everything is shifting away from him now." And I asked her, "Away to where?" And she shook her head and replied, "To wherever truth goes when people stop agreeing on lies." And for the first time I did not feel like I was inside a case file. I felt like I was outside of it, watching it move on without me. Later that evening, Jason received confirmation that Federal Review Coordination had formally separated Daniel's financial case from local jurisdiction entirely, and he said, "This is no longer about what happened on the cliff." And I looked at him and asked, "Then what is it about?" And he paused before answering, "It is about what he built around it." And that sentence stayed with me longer than anything else. But what surprised me most was not Daniel's collapse in the system. It was how little I felt pulled toward it anymore, because something in me had begun to change in a direction I did not expect, away from questions, away from noise, away from the constant need to understand everything at once. The next morning, Dr. Hannah Reed came in and said something I did not expect. She said, "Your physical recovery is stable, but your emotional stress markers are still elevated." And I remember replying quietly, "That is because my life is still being explained by people who were not there for it." And she nodded like she understood more than she said. Later, Laura arrived with a small envelope and placed it in my hands, and she said, "This is not evidence. This is something personal." And inside was a handwritten note from Jason, not as a sheriff, but as a person. And it simply said, "You are allowed to stop surviving long enough to start living." And I remember reading it twice because I did not know what that meant anymore. That afternoon, Jason came in wearing no folder, no urgency, and he said, "The case is not yours anymore." And I asked him, "Then whose is it?" And he answered, "The system's." And for the first time, that made me feel something close to relief. Days passed without new documents, without legal phrases, without people trying to translate my life into categories I did not recognize. And instead, Laura began sitting with me talking about small things, like weather in Seattle, like whether I still liked coffee with too much cream, like whether I remembered what I used to enjoy before everything became noise. And I realized I struggled to answer those questions more than any legal one. One afternoon I finally said to her, "I do not think I know how to go back to a normal life." And she replied gently, "Then do not go back, go forward." And I remember staring at her because it sounded too simple for everything I had been through. Jason joined us later that day and said, "Daniel's legal exposure is no longer the center of attention. It is now one part of a larger review." And I asked him, "Do I still need to be involved?" And he looked at me and said, "Only if you choose to be." And that was the first time I realized choice was something I had not felt in a long time. That night I asked Laura to take me outside the hospital for the first time, just to the small courtyard, and the air felt colder than I expected, but also quieter. And I remember standing there looking at nothing in particular and saying, "I thought justice would feel like something happening." And she asked me, "What does it feel like?" And I answered after a long pause, "It feels like things finally stopping." And she nodded and said, "That is sometimes what peace is." Over the next days, I stopped receiving updates about Daniel unless I asked for them. And I did not ask often, because something in me had begun to understand that knowing everything was not the same as healing, and Jason respected that without needing explanation. Instead, I started focusing on small routines, walking slowly through hospital corridors, remembering the feeling of sunlight through glass, learning again what silence sounded like when it was not filled with fear. One morning, Dr. Reed told me I could be discharged soon, and she asked, "Where will you go?" And I said I did not know yet, and she replied, "That is okay. Uncertainty is not the same as danger." And I held on to that sentence longer than any report I had read. Laura offered me her guest place in Seattle, and Jason said I would always have a safe point of contact if I needed clarity. But what mattered most was that no one demanded decisions from me anymore. And in that space I began to understand something I had never learned before, that survival was not the same as living, and living did not require answers to every broken thing. On my last evening in the hospital, I stood by the window again and looked at the city without trying to interpret it, and Jason came in quietly and said, "You look different," and I asked him, "Different how?" And he replied, "Less like someone waiting for something to happen." And I realized he was right, because for the first time since the cliff, I was not waiting for truth or justice or explanation. I was simply standing still, breathing, existing without urgency, and in that stillness I understood something simple but heavy, that my life was no longer defined by the moment I fell, or even the moment I survived, but by everything I was still here to choose after both of those things had already happened. The final morning in San Francisco felt different from all the mornings that came before it, not because anything outside had changed in a dramatic way, but because something inside me had finally stopped resisting the idea that life could continue without constant interpretation. And I remember standing by the hospital window holding a small paper cup of coffee that had gone cold, watching the fog lift slowly over the city like it was no longer trying to hide anything, when Sheriff Jason Miller walked in one last time without urgency, without a folder, without the weight of immediate crisis behind him, and he said quietly, "The Federal Review has finalized its preliminary findings." And I looked at him and asked, "And what does that mean for Daniel?" And he paused before answering, "It means the system has stopped treating him as a single actor." And for the first time, I understood that consequence does not always arrive as punishment. Sometimes it arrives as separation. Laura Bennett arrived shortly after, and she did not speak right away. She simply placed a small box on the table beside me, and when I asked what it was, she said, "Things you should have had access to earlier," and inside were personal items recovered and returned through legal channels, not dramatic, not symbolic in a loud way, but deeply human in their simplicity: a wristwatch, a folded itinerary, a small notebook with handwriting that did not belong to anyone in authority, and I remember touching the pages and realizing how fragile truth becomes when it is carried too long by other people. Jason stood near the door and said, "Daniel Whitmore has lost access to all coordinated financial structures pending permanent audit review." And I asked him, "Is he arrested?" And he shook his head slightly and said, "Not yet, but he is no longer protected by alignment." And that phrase stayed with me because it meant something I had not fully understood before, that power is not always taken, sometimes it simply stops being supported. Later that afternoon, I was discharged, not into chaos, not into headlines, but into a quieter version of reality that felt almost unfamiliar. And Laura drove me to a small place near the coast outside San Francisco, not the cliffs of Big Sur, but something gentler, something that did not feel like a memory trying to repeat itself. In the weeks that followed, I learned what it meant to live without constant reconstruction of events. Jason updated me once in a while, not with urgency, but with clarity, telling me that Daniel had entered multiple jurisdictional reviews, and that his legal circle had dissolved into independent statements that no longer supported a single narrative. And I remember saying, "So I do not need to do anything," and Jason replied, "No, you already did what mattered," and I did not fully understand that until later. Laura stayed in touch, not as someone managing a case, but as someone rebuilding a life beside me. And one evening we sat outside a small coastal cafe drinking coffee that was too strong, and she said, "Do you ever think about going back to who you were before?" And I looked out at the water and said, "I do not think she exists anymore." And for the first time that did not feel like loss, it felt like truth. Daniel was never spoken of in dramatic terms after that, only in procedural updates, his influence shrinking not because of confrontation, but because the people around him no longer agreed to carry his version forward, and that realization mattered more than any single outcome, because it showed me that collapse does not always come from force, it comes from disconnection. One morning I went back to Monterey alone, not to the cliff, but to the road leading toward it, and I stopped at a small turnout where the ocean could be seen without the drop, and I stood there for a long time without needing to assign meaning to anything, and I remember thinking that survival is not a story ending, it is a permission to stop living inside the moment that tried to end you. Jason called me later that week and said, "Things are stabilizing," and I asked, "For who?" And he answered, "For everyone who is no longer part of his structure," and I understood then that stability is not loud, it is quiet separation. Laura eventually told me that Daniel's professional network had fractured completely, not in spectacle, but in silence, as contracts dissolved and alliances withdrew until nothing coherent remained to support the version he had built, and she said, "It is strange he did not fall the way people expect." And I asked, "How did he fall?" And she replied, "He was simply no longer held up." And that sentence felt like the final explanation I needed. In time, I moved further away from San Francisco to a quieter place where mornings were not filled with questions I could not answer, and I began to understand what Jason meant when he said I had already done what mattered, because truth does not need repetition once it is released, it only needs space. There was no final confrontation, no dramatic resolution that defined everything in one moment, only the gradual return of ordinary life, of choosing what to eat, where to walk, who to trust, and learning that those choices were enough. And one evening, as the sun lowered over a calm horizon, I found a small object in my bag that I had forgotten about, a simple hotel keycard from the early days after everything began, and I held it for a long time before placing it down on the table, realizing it had no power anymore, it only had memory, and I said quietly to myself, not as a conclusion, but as understanding, that nothing that tries to erase you can define you forever. And the final thought I carried with me as the light faded was this, that peace is not what happens after the truth. Peace is what happens when you no longer need to fight it to believe it.